cruel husband sold his wife and twin daughters to an infertile CEO she never knew he secretly loved her for 10 years. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's begin with a prayer from the heart. Dear God, please continue to hold my hand through this healing journey. Fill me with strength and peace, and bless every precious member of my YouTube family, those who listen, pray, and love. Wrap them in your protection and pour joy into their lives. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter. I'm still in New York for treatment, but I'll be back in just 2 days, God willing. I miss you so much. Not hearing my voice today may feel strange, and I understand. But please, my beautiful family, don't leave the story halfway. Stay with us till the end, and if you can, please leave a like and a comment. Even one like or one kind word from you helps keep this channel alive. It means the world. James is here with love, and I'm with you in spirit, holding each of you close in my heart. Now let's begin this beautiful story, together in love, in faith, and in family.
Some loves are born in a single glance, destined to burn quietly for years, waiting for fate to write their second chapter. Champagne bubbled gold in crystal flutes as Miami's cultural elite wandered through the evening's premiere exhibition, their Louboutin heels clicking against polished Italian marble. The gallery buzzed with conversations about market trends and investment pieces, but Ron Wombolt stood transfixed before a single canvas that seemed to capture pure hope itself. The painting depicted a woman dancing alone in a storm, her face turned skyward, arms outstretched to embrace lightning that had transformed into butterflies. It was breathtaking, raw emotion translated into brushstrokes that made his chest tighten with recognition. "It's called Dancing with Dreams," came a voice like warm honey behind him. Ron turned, and his world shifted forever. The woman before him was luminous, not with the manufactured beauty of the socialites who usually pursued him, but with an inner radiance that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Her dark skin glowed under the gallery's professional lighting, and when she smiled, her entire being seemed to light up. She wore a simple black cocktail dress that highlighted her graceful curves, her natural hair styled in elegant twists that framed her face perfectly. "You painted this?" Ron asked, though he already knew from the way she looked at the canvas with the fierce pride of creation. "Guilty as charged," Peggy Boughton laughed, extending her hand. "I'm Peggy, and judging by how everyone keeps stealing glances at you, you must be someone important." Ron took her hand, feeling electricity shoot up his arm. At 28, he'd built a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions, but no business triumph had ever affected him like this woman's touch. "Ron Wombolt, and I'm really just someone who recognizes extraordinary art when he sees it." His eyes never left her face, though I suspect the artist is even more remarkable than her work. Peggy blushed, soft pink tinting her cheeks. "That's quite a line, Mr. Wombolt." "It's not a line when it's absolute truth," Ron replied, then caught himself. He was usually composed, guarded, the consummate businessman. But something about this woman stripped away every carefully constructed wall he'd built. They drifted through the gallery together, Peggy explaining her pieces with passion that made her eyes sparkle like stars. Ron found himself captivated not just by her artistic vision, but by her dreams of opening her own design studio, her obvious adoration for her twin daughters, her belief that art could heal wounds the world couldn't see. "Twins?" Ron asked, his heart sinking slightly. She was clearly committed to someone. "Floressa and Wilma," Peggy said, her voice growing impossibly tender. "They're 4 years old and absolutely everything to me. Florissa is my little artist. She's constantly drawing, creating, seeing the world in colors I never imagined. Wilma is my quiet philosopher. She notices everything, feels everything so deeply it sometimes scares me." "They sound incredible," Ron said, meaning every word. "Their father must be immensely proud." A shadow flickered across Peggy's expressive features. James is complicated, but the girls are my anchor, my reason for believing that tomorrow can be better than today. They found themselves on the gallery's rooftop terrace, Miami's skyline spread before them like scattered diamonds. The November breeze carried hints of ocean and jasmine, and the city's energy hummed around them like a lullaby. "Tell me about your dreams, Ron Wombolt," Peggy said, leaning against the railing. Moonlight caught the gold flecks in her dark eyes. What makes a successful businessman stand in an art gallery, looking like he's searching for his missing piece? Ron was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the silver light. He'd never been this open with anyone, but something about her made honesty feel safe. "I've built an empire," he admitted, "but success feels hollow when you have no one to share it with. Money, power, achievements, they're just numbers without meaning. I suppose I'm searching for purpose, connection, something real in a world that often feels manufactured." "And what would real look like to you?" "A family," Ron said, the words emerging before his guard could stop them. "Someone to build a life with, not a business arrangement. Children to watch discover the world. Love that transcends quarterly earnings and board meetings." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Someone who looks at me the way you look at your paintings, like I'm something precious worth cherishing." Peggy's breath caught audibly. In the moonlight, Ron Wombolt was devastating. His piercing blue eyes held depths she wanted to explore forever. His dark hair caught the breeze in a way that made her fingers itch to touch it. And when he smiled, his whole face transformed from corporate titan to romantic poet. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," Ron replied, stepping closer. The space between them crackled with electricity. "Peggy, I know we just met, but I feel like I've been waiting my entire life for this moment. For you." Their faces were inches apart now, the chemistry between them so intense it was almost visible. Peggy's heart hammered as she looked into his eyes, seeing something she'd never found in James's gaze: genuine tenderness, respect, a love that promised safety instead of storms. "Ron, There you are, baby." Both jumped apart as James Ruffer approached, his expensive suit unable to hide the slight unsteadiness that suggested several drinks. He was conventionally handsome, but there was something sharp in his smile, something possessive in how he immediately pulled Peggy against his side. "James," Peggy said, her voice carefully neutral, "this is Ron Wombolt. He was admiring my work." James's eyes sharpened with recognition and calculation. "The Ron Wombolt? Wombolt Industries?" He extended his hand with the eager enthusiasm of someone sensing opportunity. "James Ruffer. I develop residential properties. We should discuss business sometime." Ron shook his hand politely, but his eyes remained on Peggy, who had subtly pulled away from James's grip. "Perhaps," Ron said diplomatically. "Well, we should leave," James said, his hand firm on Peggy's lower back. "The babysitter charges overtime, and someone has an early morning with the girls." "Of course," Ron said, his eyes meeting Peggy's one final time. In them she saw regret, longing, and a question he couldn't voice. "It was lovely meeting you, Ron," Peggy said softly. "I hope you find what you're searching for." As James led her away, Ron watched them go, memorizing everything. The way she moved with natural grace, the sound of her laughter still echoing in his ears, the way her eyes had softened when she looked at him. He didn't know that Peggy glanced back once, her own heart breaking with the knowledge that she'd just met the man she could have loved completely, if only circumstances were different. The exclusive Fontainebleau Hotel's private suite felt like purgatory as James Ruffer sat across from Dashiell Rivers, his hands trembling as he signed documents that would haunt him for eternity. The Miami sunset outside painted the sky blood red, an omen he was too desperate to heed. $2 million in gambling debts, completely forgiven, Dashiell said, his voice carrying no warmth despite his expensive suit and cultured accent. But understand perfectly, Ruffer. Wombolt gets exactly what he's paying for. A wife, a ready-made family, no complications, 7 years as stipulated in our agreement. James nodded, not trusting his voice. His alternative was a shallow grave in the Everglades. 3 hours later, he sat his wife down in their cramped apartment, eviction notices scattered across their kitchen table like fallen leaves. "Peggy, I've found our salvation," he began, unable to meet her eyes. 4 years had passed since Peggy Boutin became Mrs. Wombolt in name only, and she stood in the master suite of a mansion that felt like a beautiful prison. Morning Miami sunshine streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a room worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. She had her own wing, her own sanctuary, her own carefully constructed life within these walls. Ron had never demanded intimacy, never pushed for more than her presence, never made her feel like the commodity she knew herself to be. The twins, now 8, had flourished beyond her wildest dreams. They called Ron Daddy with genuine affection, had no memory of their transaction-based arrival, knew only love and security, and the kind of childhood every parent wished they could provide. And Ron, patient, impossible, wonderful Ron, treated her like a queen he was afraid to approach, a treasure he was honored to protect. She caught the longing in his eyes sometimes, quickly masked behind gentlemanly restraint. She felt the careful distance he maintained, the way he never let their hands brush accidentally, how he requested permission for the smallest gestures. He was waiting, she realized. After 4 years, he was still waiting for her to come to him willingly, never knowing she'd been sold like property, never understanding that her distance came from shame, not indifference. Peggy pressed her palm against the window, watching Ron play with the twins in the garden below. His rich laughter carried upward as Floresa showed him her latest masterpiece, and Wilma curled trustingly in his lap with a book. He was everything she dreamed of that magical night at the gallery, and everything she believed she could never deserve. If only he knew, she thought, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. If only I could tell him that this heart he's been so patient with has belonged to him all along. Chapter 2. The Beautiful Pretense. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, that we don't deserve love, that kindness always comes with a price, that hearts can be trained to stop hoping for miracles. The Wombolt mansion awakened with the gentle chaos that only children could orchestrate. 8-year-old Floresa burst through the kitchen's French doors like a tiny hurricane, her pristine St. Catherine's Academy uniform already decorated with paint splatters despite the day barely beginning. "Daddy Ron," she called, launching herself at the tall figure by the espresso machine. "Look what I created for you." Ron caught her effortlessly, his Armani suit somehow remaining immaculate, even as paint-covered fingers grabbed his lapels. His face, which moments before had worn the serious expression of a man preparing for hostile takeover negotiations, transformed instantly into something infinitely warmer. "Let me see," he said, examining the paper she thrust at him with the gravity of a museum curator. "This is revolutionary abstract expressionism." "It's our family," Floresa giggled, pointing to colorful stick figures. "That's you in your fancy suits. That's Mommy looking beautiful. That's me and Wilma. And that's our house with the big garden." Ron's chest tightened with emotions he couldn't name. Our family. If only the word carried the weight of choice rather than circumstance. "It's perfect, Princess. This deserves a place of honor in my office." "Really?" Floresa's eyes sparkled like captured starlight. "Really? The most important art gets the most important space." From the doorway, Peggy watched this exchange with a heart full of contradictions. Ron's tenderness with her daughters never failed to move her, but it also reminded her daily of the deception underlying their domestic bliss. He treated them like precious gifts rather than burdens acquired through circumstance, loved them with the devotion of a father who'd chosen them rather than inherited them through a sordid transaction. "Mommy," Wilma materialized at Peggy's side with her characteristic quiet grace. Daddy Ron made pancakes shaped like butterflies. "Did he?" Peggy smiled, though something twisted in her chest. 4 years of this beautiful charade, and she still felt like an actress who'd forgotten her character's motivation. Ron looked up, his eyes finding hers across the sun-drenched kitchen. For a heartbeat, their careful pretense cracked, and she saw the hunger there, quickly masked but unmistakable. Not merely physical desire, though, that simmered beneath the surface, but something deeper. A longing for her to look at him the way she looked at the twins, with uncomplicated love and absolute trust. "Good morning, Peggy," he said, his voice calibrated to the tone he'd perfected over 4 years, warm but respectful, caring but never presumptuous. "I made extra. I know you usually skip breakfast, but—" "Thank you," she interrupted, perhaps too quickly. His consideration always undid her composure. "That's incredibly thoughtful." Soraya Delacroix chose that moment to enter, her Manolo Blahnik heels announcing her arrival against marble floors. At 32, she possessed the kind of refined elegance that graced Vogue covers and the razor-sharp intelligence that made her indispensable to Ron's business empire. "Good morning, beautiful family," she said, emphasizing the word family with subtle meaning that made Peggy's cheeks warm. Soraya possessed an unsettling ability to see beneath surfaces, to understand currents that others missed entirely. "Soraya?" The twins abandoned breakfast to embrace her legs. She was their glamorous aunt figure, the sophisticated woman who brought them treasures from around the world and never condescended to their 8-year-old perspectives. "Good morning to my favorite artists," Soraya said, then glanced meaningfully between Ron and Peggy. "Ron, your 9 o'clock rescheduled to 10:30. Something about revising the Coral Gables project specifications." "Fine," Ron said absently, still watching Peggy butter toast with unnecessary concentration. Soraya's observant gaze missed nothing, not how Ron's attention lingered on Peggy, not how Peggy's hand trembled slightly, reaching for preserves, not the careful distance they maintained even during casual moments. 4 years, Soraya thought with frustration. 4 years of this exquisite torture. She'd been Ron's executive assistant for 6 years, had watched him command boardrooms full of powerful men, but had never witnessed him as vulnerable as he became around the woman he believed had married him for security rather than love. "Girls, finish getting ready for school," Peggy suggested. "Mrs. Carmen will drive you in 15 minutes. As the twins scampered upstairs, the kitchen settled into charged silence that had become typical between the adults in this house. "I'll be late tonight," Ron said, adjusting his tie with practiced efficiency. "Board dinner at the Ocean Club. Don't wait up." The casual dismissal stung more than Peggy cared to admit. "Of course, I'm having dinner with Aviora anyway." Something flickered in Ron's eyes. Disappointment. Relief. "Good. You should maintain your friendships, your independence." Another subtle knife twist. He wanted her to have her own existence, separate from his, because what they shared wasn't real enough to be possessive about, could never be genuine enough to warrant jealousy. After Ron departed for downtown Miami, Peggy wandered the mansion like a ghost haunting a museum. Every room was perfectly curated, every surface gleaming, every detail chosen with exquisite taste. It was a showpiece house, not a home, beautiful and empty and echoing with unspoken words. She paused in Ron's study, drawn as always to the wall where he'd hung Florissa's artwork alongside million-dollar masterpieces. A Picasso shared space with finger paintings, A Monet hung beside crayon drawings of their family. Most men of his stature would have relegated children's art to refrigerators or bedroom walls. Ron displayed them like priceless treasures. "He loves them," she whispered to the empty room. "He loves them as if they were truly his. He loves you too." Peggy spun to find Soraya in the doorway, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "I don't understand what you mean," Peggy said, but conviction had fled her voice. Soraya entered, closing the door with deliberate care. "Peggy, I've worked for Ron for 6 years. I've observed him with dozens of women, socialites, supermodels, brilliant businesswomen, European royalty. Not one ever made him look the way he looks at you." "He looks at me like I'm his responsibility," Peggy said bitterly. "Someone he's obligated to care for. He looks at you like you painted the sunrise specifically for him." Soraya moved closer, her voice gentle but insistent. "The man I work for is decisive, commanding, accustomed to acquiring whatever he desires. But around you, he's as uncertain as a teenager with his first crush." Peggy's chest constricted. "You don't understand the full situation. Then illuminate me. Because what I observe is two people desperately in love, circling each other like they're afraid to breathe the same air." "If only it were that simple," Peggy thought. "If only you knew how I arrived here, what I truly represent to him." "It's complicated," she said finally. "The most beautiful love stories usually are." That evening, Peggy met Aviora Martinez at their favorite oceanfront cafe in South Beach. Aviora, a single mother who'd become Peggy's lifeline, was the one person who knew her before the Wombolt mansion, before designer wardrobes and private schools, and a life of luxury that felt like wearing someone else's identity. "You look exhausted," Aviora observed, studying her friend over wine glasses that caught the restaurant's candlelight. "Still having those sleepless nights?" "How can I sleep when every day feels like performing in a play where I've forgotten my lines?" Peggy asked, immediately glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "What performance?" "You're married to a man who adores you. Your daughters are thriving. You live in paradise." "I'm not truly married to him," Peggy interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not in any meaningful way." Aviora frowned. "What do you mean?" Peggy remained silent so long that Aviora wondered if she'd answer at all. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with shame. "We've never been intimate, Aviora. Ron has never... We're not even genuinely close friends. We're simply cohabitating. For the girl's sake." "But why?" "The man is obviously crazy about you." "Because I'm not his wife. I'm his... obligation." Aviora leaned forward, her expression fierce. "Peggy Boutin, listen carefully. I've watched how that man looks at you. I've seen him with those girls. That's not obligation. That's devotion. That's love. You can't possibly understand." "Then make me understand, because from my perspective, you're living every woman's dream while acting like it's a nightmare." Peggy's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. How could she explain that dreams built on deception eventually crumble? That every kindness Ron showed felt like borrowing against a debt she could never repay? "Sometimes," she whispered, "I catch him looking at me like I'm something precious. And for just a moment I allow myself to imagine what it would be like if he truly saw me that way. If I actually deserved it." "Oh, honey," Aviora reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "What makes you believe you don't deserve love?" But Peggy just shook her head, unable to voice the truth that haunted her. "Because I was sold to him like merchandise. Because everything we have is built on a transaction. Because if he knew the reality, he'd look at me with disgust instead of longing." Meanwhile, across town at the exclusive Ocean Club, Ron endured a bored dinner that felt interminable. Conversations swirled around him, merger discussions, quarterly projections, expansion strategies. but his mind remained at the mansion, wondering what Peggy was doing, if she was happy, if she ever considered him as more than a convenient provider. "You're distracted tonight," observed Leander Stone, Ron's best friend and business partner. As the evening concluded and other board members dispersed, Leander moved his chair closer. "Want to discuss it?" Ron swirled whiskey in his crystal tumbler, watching amber liquid catch the club's elegant lighting. "Do you ever feel like your life is exactly what you thought you wanted, but nothing like what you actually dreamed?" "Philosophical mood, I see." Leander's expression grew concerned. "This is about Peggy." It wasn't a question. Leander had known Ron since Harvard Law School, had watched him build his empire, had served as best man at the strangest wedding ceremony either had ever witnessed. A contract marriage that appeared perfect on paper, but felt hollow in practice. "I love her," Ron said simply. "I've been in love with her for 10 years, and I finally have her in my house, in my life, raising children who call me daddy, and I've never felt more isolated." "Have you told her how you feel?" Ron laughed without humor. "She married me for security, Leander. For stability for her daughters. The last thing she needs is me complicating our arrangement with messy emotions. Maybe she needs exactly that. Or maybe she'd run and I'd lose the only family I've ever had." Leander studied his friend's face in the restaurant's dim lighting. Ron Wombolt commanded respect from world leaders and wielded power with effortless grace. But love had reduced him to this, a man terrified to reach for what he wanted most. "You know what I think," Leander said finally. "I think you're both so busy protecting yourselves that you're missing the most obvious truth, which is that she's just as terrified as you are, and maybe, just maybe, she's waiting for you to find the courage to take the first step." As Ron drove home through Miami's glittering streets, Leander's words echoed persistently. But courage and love weren't always sufficient, were they? Some distances couldn't be bridged with mere wanting. He pulled into his circular driveway, the mansion's windows glowing warmly against the darkness. Somewhere inside, Peggy was probably reading bedtime stories to the twins, her voice soft and musical, her love for them unconditional and pure. If only she could love him even half as much. "Tomorrow," he promised himself. "Tomorrow I'll find the courage to tell her the truth." But tomorrow had a way of becoming yesterday, and some confessions were more difficult to make than corporate acquisitions. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. The past has a way of returning when we least expect it, wearing new clothes but carrying old wounds, demanding payment for debts we thought were buried forever. It was a perfect Miami morning when the foundation of Peggy's carefully constructed world began to crumble. She stood in the mansion's pristine kitchen, watching the twins demolish their breakfast with the efficient enthusiasm of 8-year-olds preparing for another day at their exclusive private school, when the doorbell rang. Mrs. Carmen, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately set Peggy's nerves on edge. "Mrs. Wombolt, there's a gentleman at the door asking to speak with you. Says his name is James Ruffer." The coffee mug slipped from Peggy's nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of ceramic and dark liquid. Both twins looked up from their pancakes, eyes wide with concern. "Mommy," Wilma's soft voice cut through Peggy's paralysis. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Peggy managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "Mrs. Carmen, please tell Mr. Ruffer I'll be right there. Girls, finish your breakfast. You don't want to be late for school." But even as she spoke, Peggy's mind was racing in circles. James, here. After 4 years of silence, 4 years of peace, 4 years of allowing herself to believe that chapter of her life was closed forever. She found him standing in the mansion's opulent foyer, and for a moment she barely recognized the man who had once been her husband. Gone was the disheveled, desperate figure who had sold her like chattel to pay his gambling debts. This James was clean-shaven, well-dressed in an expensive suit, his hair professionally styled. He looked like the man she'd fallen in love with a lifetime ago, before addiction and desperation had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. "Hello, Peggy," he said, his voice carrying that old charm that had once made her heart race. Now it only made her stomach churn with dread. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, glancing toward the kitchen where her daughters were finishing breakfast, blissfully unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. "Can't a father visit his children?" James asked, and there was something dangerous in his smile. "It's been 4 years, Peggy. 4 years since I've seen my daughters." "They're not," Peggy began, then stopped herself. Legally, biologically, James was still their father, no matter what her heart knew to be true. "They don't remember you, James. To them, Ron is their father." Something dark flickered across James's features. "Ron, your husband." He said the word like it tasted bitter. "Tell me, Peggy, does he know the terms of your arrangement?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Peggy felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. "What do you want?" "Just to see how my family is doing. You look well, expensive clothes, beautiful home, everything money can buy. And the girls." He craned his neck toward the kitchen, where Florissa's laughter rang out like silver bells. "They sound happy, healthy, well cared for." "They are," Peggy said fiercely. "They're loved and safe and living with a man who isn't their real father," James finished. "I wonder what he'd think if he knew the truth about how you came to be here, about what you really are." Peggy's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I am their mother. I am the woman who has raised them, loved them, protected them. You are the woman I sold to pay my debts," James said quietly, his words hitting her like physical blows. "And unless certain arrangements are made, Ron Wombolt is going to learn exactly what kind of wife he really has." Before Peggy could respond, the sound of small feet running across marble filled the foyer. The twins appeared, backpacks slung over their shoulders, ready for school. They stopped short when they saw the stranger standing with their mother. "Mommy?" Florissa asked, her artist's eye immediately picking up on the tension in the room. "Who is this man?" Peggy's heart shattered as she looked at her daughters, these beautiful, innocent children who knew nothing of the darkness that had brought them to this mansion, who believed in the fairy tale life they were living. How could she explain that the monster from their mother's past had returned to threaten their happiness? "This is," she began, then stopped, unable to form the words. "I'm James," he said, crouching down to the twins' eye level with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm an old friend of your mother's." Wilma, always the more perceptive twin, stepped closer to Peggy and took her hand. "Mommy, you're shaking." "I'm fine, baby," Peggy lied, squeezing her daughter's small fingers. "Why don't you girls go wait in the car? Mrs. Carmen will take you to school." "But," Florissa started to protest. "Now, please," Peggy said with more sharpness than she intended. Both girls flinched, and she immediately regretted her tone. "I'll see you after school, okay? Have a wonderful day." The twins exchanged worried glances, but obediently headed toward the garage. As soon as they were out of sight, Peggy whirled on James. "How dare you come here? How dare you frighten my children?" "Our children," James corrected. "And I'm clean now, Peggy. Sober for 8 months. I've got a job, an apartment, a new life. I want to be part of theirs." "You gave up that right when you sold us like property," Peggy hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I saved us," James shot back. "You were about to be homeless. The girls were going to go hungry. I found a solution that gave you the life you always wanted. Luxury, security, a man who could provide for you better than I ever could. You found a way to save your own skin and told yourself it was noble," Peggy said. "Don't you dare rewrite history." James's facade of reasonableness began to crack. You think you're better than me now, living in your mansion, playing house with your billionaire? You're still the same woman who was sold to the highest bidder. And your precious Ron, does he know that's what he bought? A wife and instant family packaged together for his convenience. Get out, Peggy whispered, her voice trembling with rage and fear. Get out of my house. Your house, James laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. Nothing here belongs to you, Peggy. Not the house, not the car, not the fancy clothes, not even your own children. It all belongs to Ron Wombolt, including you. And if he knew the truth about what? Both Peggy and James spun toward the voice. Ron stood in the doorway, still in his business suit from an early morning meeting, his blue eyes cold as Arctic ice as they took in the scene before him. Peggy's heart stopped. How much had he heard? Ron, she managed. This is James. He was just leaving. Ron's gaze moved from Peggy's pale, stricken face to James's calculating expression, and something dangerous settled over his features. Ron Wombolt hadn't built a business empire by being naive or easily fooled. He could sense predators from a mile away, and every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about the man standing in his foyer. James Ruffer, James said, extending his hand with false bonhomie. We met briefly years ago. I'm Peggy's ex-husband. Ron didn't take the offered hand. Instead, he moved to stand beside Peggy, close enough that his presence felt like a shield between her and whatever danger James represented. I remember, Ron said, his voice carefully controlled. I wasn't aware you were still in Miami. Just got back, James said, his smile becoming more strained as he realized his charm wasn't working on Ron. Wanted to see my daughters. It's been too long. 4 years, Ron said. It wasn't a question. Yes, well, I've been getting my life together, clean and sober now, ready to be the father they deserve. Peggy made a small, wounded sound, and Ron's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of comfort and protection that was purely instinctive. The girls don't know you, Ron said quietly. To them, I'm their father. I've been the one tucking them in at night, helping with homework, cheering at dance recitals. I'm the one they run to when they're hurt or scared. What exactly do you think you can offer them that they don't already have? James's mask slipped completely then, revealing the manipulative, bitter man beneath. I can offer them their real father, their biological connection, their true family. Family isn't about biology, Ron said, his voice like steel. It's about love, commitment, showing up every single day. It's about putting their needs before your own, always. Can you say you've done that? I'm here now, James said desperately. I want another chance. 4 years too late. The finality in Ron's voice seemed to hit James like a physical blow. His eyes darted between Ron and Peggy, calculating, searching for leverage. Well, he said finally, his voice taking on a silky, dangerous tone, I suppose I'll have to speak with my lawyer about custody arrangements. After all, blood is thicker than financial arrangements. The words hung in the air like a threat. Peggy went even paler, if that were possible, and Ron's jaw tightened. I think you should leave now, Ron said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Of course, James said, straightening his jacket, but this isn't over. I'll be in touch. He looked directly at Peggy. We have so much to discuss about the past and the future. After James left, the mansion felt like it was holding its breath. Ron and Peggy stood in the foyer, the space between them charged with unspoken questions and half-revealed truths. Peggy, Ron began carefully. What did he mean about financial arrangements? Peggy's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. How could she explain without destroying everything? How could she tell the man she'd grown to love that she'd come to him not through choice but through sale? It's complicated, she whispered. Ron studied her face, seeing the fear there, the shame, the desperate desire to run. His heart ached for her, but his mind was already working, putting together pieces of a puzzle he'd never realized existed. Whatever it is, he said softly, whatever happened before, it doesn't change anything between us. You and the girls are my family. Nothing James says or does can change that. But even as he spoke the words, Ron knew they weren't entirely true, because secrets had a way of poisoning even the strongest foundations, and whatever Peggy was hiding from him was clearly tearing her apart. That night, after the twins were safely tucked into bed and the mansion had settled into its evening quiet, Ron stood in his study and made a phone call that would change everything. "Amadeo," he said when his head of security answered, "I need you to run a complete background check on James Ruffer, and I need to know everything about his connection to my wife. Everything. Because love might forgive secrets, but it couldn't survive them." And Ron Wombolt was about to discover that the foundation of his perfect life was built on lies that ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. Chapter 4. When Masks Begin to Fall. Truth has a way of demanding recognition, like sunlight seeping through cracks in a curtain, illuminating everything we've tried so desperately to keep hidden in darkness. The Miami dawn broke gray and restless, matching Ron's mood as he sat in his study, surrounded by files that Amadeo Santos had delivered at 6 a.m. His head of security was nothing if not thorough: financial records, police reports, hospital admissions, witness statements, all painting a picture of James Ruffer that made Ron's blood run cold. But it was the final document that had stopped his heart entirely. A contract signed 4 years ago, bearing both James's signature and that of Dashiell Rivers, a name Ron recognized from Miami's underbelly of loan sharks and criminal financiers. Financial arrangement for the settlement of debts totaling $2 million. Transfer of custody and care. 7-year agreement. The legalese was carefully worded, but the meaning was clear enough to make Ron feel physically sick. Peggy hadn't married him for love or even security. She had been sold to him like property, and he had been too blind, too desperate for her love, to see the truth. "Sir?" Amadeo's voice came from the doorway. The older man had worked for Ron for 8 years, had seen him through hostile takeovers and corporate warfare, but had never seen his employer look so utterly shattered. "How long have you known?" Ron asked without looking up from the contract. "I suspected something wasn't right from the beginning," Amadeo admitted, his accented English careful and precise. "The way she came to you, the circumstances, the speed of everything. But the paperwork looked legitimate on the surface. Rivers is very good at covering his tracks. It wasn't until I dug deeper after James's return that I found the connection to his trafficking operation. You were so happy, and she and the children seemed safe here. So you said nothing. I protected you the only way I knew how, by making sure they stayed safe. Whatever brought Mrs. Wombolt to you, she's been a good wife, a loving mother. The children adore you. You've built something beautiful together." Ron laughed bitterly. "Built on lies. All of it." "Built on love," Amadeo corrected gently. "Whatever the beginning was, what you have now is real." Before Ron could respond, Soraya knocked on the study door. She took one look at the scattered papers, at Ron's haggard expression, and closed the door behind her. "James Ruffer was here yesterday," she said without preamble. "I heard from Mrs. Carmen, and judging by your face, you've learned something that's broken your heart." Ron held up the contract. "Did you know?" Soraya moved closer, scanning the document with the sharp intelligence that made her invaluable. Her face grew pale as she read. "My God," she whispered. "He sold them. He actually sold them." "And I bought them," Ron said, his voice hollow. "I bought a wife and children like I was purchasing furniture for the mansion." "You did no such thing," Soraya said fiercely. You provided a home for a woman and children who needed protection. You gave them love, safety, everything they could ever want. I gave them a cage, Ron corrected. A beautiful, luxurious cage, but a cage nonetheless. No wonder she can't love me. How could she love the man who owns her? Ron. She's been trapped here for 4 years, Soraya, playing the perfect wife while knowing she had no choice, no freedom. And I've been so goddamn blind, thinking she was choosing to stay, that maybe someday she might actually care for me. Soraya sank into the chair across from his desk, her usual composure cracking. What are you going to do? Ron was quiet for a long moment, staring at the contract that had destroyed his world. I'm going to set her free. Meanwhile, in the mansion's breakfast room, Peggy sat across from her daughters as they ate their cereal, but her mind was miles away. She'd barely slept, James's threats echoing in her head all night. Blood is thicker than financial arrangements. The words felt like a noose tightening around her throat. Mommy, you're not eating, Wilma observed with the quiet perception that always caught adults off guard. I'm not very hungry, sweetheart, Peggy managed, forcing a smile that felt like plastic. Are you sick? Florisa asked, her expressive face creased with worry. You look sad. I am sad, Peggy thought. I'm terrified and ashamed and completely lost. But she couldn't say that to her 8-year-old daughters, couldn't burden them with the adult complications that threatened to tear their world apart. Just tired, she lied. I didn't sleep well. Maybe Daddy Ron could make you his special hot chocolate, Florisa suggested. It always makes me feel better when I'm sad. Peggy's heart clenched. Daddy Ron. The man who had never once made them feel like burdens, who had loved them from the first day they'd arrived at his mansion, scared, confused 4-year-olds who missed their father and didn't understand why their mother cried herself to sleep every night. That's a lovely idea, Peggy said, but her voice caught on the words. The twins exchanged one of their wordless twin communications, the kind that made Peggy feel like they could read each other's minds. Mommy, Wilma said carefully, yesterday when that man came to see you, you got very upset. Peggy's blood chilled. What man? The man in the fancy suit who said he was your friend, Florisa chimed in. But he didn't seem like a friend. Friends don't make people shake and look scared. God, they're too perceptive, Peggy thought desperately. Too young to see so much, understand so much. Sometimes, she said carefully, adults have complicated relationships with people from their past. It doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen. But even as she spoke the words, Peggy knew they were a lie. James wouldn't give up easily. He'd seen the mansion, the life they were living, and his calculating mind would already be working on ways to exploit it, whether through blackmail, custody battles, or simply making their lives miserable until Ron decided they weren't worth the trouble. Is he coming back? Wilma asked, her small hand reaching across the table to touch Peggy's. I don't know, baby, Peggy answered honestly. But if he does, Daddy Ron won't let him hurt us. You know that, right? Both girls nodded solemnly. Their faith in Ron was absolute, unshakable. He was their protector, their provider, the man who read them bedtime stories and helped with math homework and never raised his voice even when they tracked mud through his pristine house. If only they knew, Peggy thought. If only they knew that Daddy Ron might not be able to protect us from this. That some things are bigger than money and power and good intentions. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Ron's arrival, and Peggy's heart began to race. She hadn't seen him since the confrontation with James yesterday, hadn't known how to face him with all her secrets, threatening to spill out. He appeared in the doorway looking like he hadn't slept either, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled, his eyes holding shadows she'd never seen before. Good morning, girls, he said, and his voice was normal enough, warm and affectionate as he ruffled their hair. But when his eyes met Peggy's, she saw something that made her stomach clench with dread. He knows, she realized with crystal clarity. He knows something. Daddy Ron. Florissa bounced up from her chair. Mommy's sad and tired. Can you make her feel better? Ron's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. Because that's what she was, Peggy realized, whatever the legal documents said. In every way that mattered, Florissa and Wilma were Ron's children. I'll certainly try, Princess, he said, but his eyes were still on Peggy, searching, questioning, aching with something that might have been disappointment. Girls, why don't you go get your backpacks? Peggy suggested, kneading them out of the room before whatever was coming next. You don't want to be late for school. As soon as the twins disappeared upstairs, the atmosphere in the breakfast room grew heavy with unspoken words. Peggy, Ron began, and she could hear the careful control in his voice. We need to talk. I know, she whispered, not trusting her voice to be stronger. Not here. Not now. Tonight, after the girls are asleep. My study. It sounded like a death sentence. Ron, Tonight, he repeated, but not unkindly. Whatever this is, whatever's happening, we're going to face it together. All right? Peggy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Together. As if they were really a team, really partners, instead of owner and property. But even as terror gripped her heart, some small part of her felt relieved. The secrets were coming out, the lies were crumbling, and maybe, just maybe, there would be freedom on the other side of the truth, even if it meant losing everything she'd come to love. The day passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Ron went to the office but couldn't concentrate on board meetings or merger negotiations. Every time he tried to focus on business, he saw Peggy's face from that morning, pale, frightened, beautiful, and utterly lost. Soraya kept his schedule clear after lunch, fielding calls and rescheduling appointments without being asked. She knew him well enough to recognize when her boss was fighting the battle of his life, even if the battlefield was his own heart. Sir, she said around 3 o'clock, appearing in his office doorway with the kind of careful expression that meant she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. Leander Stone is here to see you. Ron looked up from the contract he'd been staring at for the past hour. I didn't have an appointment with Leander. He says it's urgent, about Mrs. Wombolt. Ice water replaced the blood in Ron's veins. Send him in. Leander entered with the grim expression of a man delivering bad news. As Ron's lawyer and best friend, he'd seen the contract, understood its implications, and spent the morning making phone calls that had only made the situation worse. It's all legal, he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Ron's desk. Technically, James Ruffer had the right to make custody arrangements for his minor children. The financial aspect is murky. Human trafficking laws would apply if this went to court, but the custody transfer is ironclad. Meaning he could demand the children back tomorrow if he wanted to push the issue. Ron felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. And Peggy? The marriage is real, regardless of how it came about, but if James wanted to be vindictive, he could expose the circumstances publicly. Imagine the headlines: billionaire buys wife and children to satisfy infertility. Your reputation would be destroyed, and Peggy would be humiliated beyond repair. Ron buried his face in his hands. Jesus Christ. There's more, Leander continued grimly. I had my people look into James Ruffer's recent activities. He's clean and sober, as he claimed, but he's also broke. Lost his job 2 weeks ago, behind on rent, desperate. The expensive suits and hotel stays. All borrowed money and credit cards he'll never be able to pay back. And desperate men do desperate things. You think he's here for money. I think he's here for whatever he can get. Money, custody, the satisfaction of destroying what you've built together. Maybe all three. Ron was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the disaster facing his family. Because that's what they were, whatever the law said, whatever the contracts claimed. They were his family, and he would fight heaven and hell to protect them. "What do you recommend?" he asked finally. "Legally, you're in a strong position. 4 years of de facto adoption, financial support, emotional bonding with the children. Any family court would be reluctant to disrupt that stability. The only reason you haven't filed formal adoption papers is because James never legally terminated his parental rights, something your lawyers have been quietly working on. But these cases take years when the biological parent can't be located. But legally isn't the same as practically. James holds enough ammunition to make all your lives miserable. And if I just let them go?" Leander leaned forward, his expression intense. "Ron, I've known you for 15 years. I've never seen you as happy as you've been these past 4 years. Those girls worship you, and Peggy—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Whatever brought her to you, she's built a life here, a real life. Don't let fear make you throw that away." But Ron was already shaking his head. "She never had a choice, Leander. For 4 years she's been trapped here, playing a role she never wanted. How can I keep her prisoner just because I love her? Have you considered that maybe she's not a prisoner anymore? That maybe she's choosing to stay? How can she choose when she doesn't know she's free to leave?" It was a question that would haunt Ron for the rest of the day, following him home to the mansion where Peggy waited with fear in her eyes, and their daughters played in blissful ignorance of the storm about to break over their family. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, the truth would finally set them all free, or destroy them completely. And Ron Wombolt, master of the universe, billionaire titan of industry, had never felt more powerless in his life. Chapter 5. The Storm Before Dawn. Sometimes the cruelest wounds are inflicted by the very people who once promised to love us, their words becoming weapons designed to destroy the happiness they can no longer share. The elegant lobby of the Four Seasons Hotel buzzed with the afternoon energy of Miami's elite, but Peggy barely noticed the marble floors or crystal chandeliers as she sat across from James in a secluded corner booth. She'd agreed to meet him only to keep him away from the mansion, away from her daughters, away from Ron's world that felt increasingly fragile with each passing hour. James looked different in the harsh afternoon light filtering through the hotel's windows. Older, harder, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent fighting demons she'd tried to forget. But his smile was the same predatory expression she remembered from their worst days together. "You look beautiful, Peggy," he said, his voice carrying that false charm that had once made her heart race and now made her skin crawl. "Wealth agrees with you." "What do you want, James?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Say what you came to say and leave my family alone." "Our family," he corrected, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "Those are my daughters, Peggy, my flesh and blood, and you're my wife. Legally, you still bear my name on the original documents that brought you to Wombolt." Peggy's hands clenched in her lap. "I haven't been your wife in any meaningful way for 4 years. You sold that right when you traded us for your gambling debts." "I saved us," James said, his voice taking on the self-righteous tone she remembered all too well. "You were about to lose everything. Our home, our security, our future. I found a solution that gave you and the girls a life of luxury beyond anything I could have provided. You found a way to save your own worthless skin and convinced yourself it was noble," Peggy shot back, her voice low but venomous. "Don't rewrite history, James." "I know what you are." Something dangerous flickered in James's eyes. "And what am I, Peggy? A man who made hard choices to protect his family? Or are you going to pretend you haven't benefited from every single day of our arrangement?" "Our arrangement?" Peggy laughed bitterly. Is that what you call selling your wife and children like livestock? I call it securing your future. James leaned forward, his voice taking on an intimate tone that made her want to run. Look at you, designer clothes, perfect hair, living in a mansion that costs more than most people make in a lifetime. Your daughters go to the best schools, have everything they could want. You've been playing house with a billionaire for 4 years. Tell me, Peggy, what's so terrible about that? The fact that I never had a choice, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. The fact that every kindness he's shown me, every moment of happiness I've found, is built on the knowledge that I was purchased like property. James's expression shifted, becoming almost gentle, a manipulation she recognized from years of living with him. But has he been unkind to you? Has he hurt you or the girls? Has he demanded things you weren't willing to give? Despite herself, Peggy found herself thinking of Ron's careful distance, his respectful treatment of her boundaries, the way he'd never once made her feel like she owed him anything beyond her presence in his home. No, she admitted reluctantly. He's been wonderful to us. Then what's the problem? James asked, pressing his advantage. You have a good life, Peggy, a safe life. The girls are happy and healthy. You should be grateful. Grateful? The word exploded from her lips louder than she'd intended, drawing glances from other patrons. She lowered her voice, but the fury remained. Grateful that you sold me. Grateful that I've spent 4 years living a lie. You think it's a lie? James's voice turned calculating. What exactly do you think your relationship with Wombolt really is? Peggy was quiet for a moment, thinking of the way Ron looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her, the careful way he maintained distance while clearly longing for closeness. It's complicated, she said finally. It's simple, James corrected. He bought himself a family because he couldn't have one naturally. You're his acquisition, Peggy. A beautiful, convenient wife who came with ready-made children to satisfy his paternal instincts. Do you really think a man like Ron Wombolt, who could have any woman in the world, would choose a struggling single mother with baggage if she hadn't been delivered to him gift-wrapped? Each word was designed to hurt, and they found their mark with surgical precision. Peggy had wondered the same things herself during the long, sleepless nights when she lay in her separate bedroom, listening for footsteps that never came. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Don't I? James leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Has he ever told you he loves you, Peggy? In 4 years of marriage, has he ever said the words? The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. He's respectful, Peggy said weakly. He's kind and patient and he treats you exactly like what you are, a possession he's paid for and intends to keep in good condition, James finished. When was the last time he touched you? Really touched you like a husband touches a wife? Peggy's cheeks burned with humiliation. The truth was, Ron had never touched her with anything beyond casual courtesy. No passionate kisses, no intimate embraces, no whispered endearments in the darkness. They lived like polite strangers sharing a house, beautiful and empty and utterly without the kind of connection she'd dreamed of as a young woman. He respects my boundaries, she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. He respects his investment, James corrected cruelly. Think about it, Peggy. If he really loved you, if he really saw you as his wife rather than his property, wouldn't he have tried to win your heart by now? Wouldn't he have courted you, pursued you, tried to make you fall in love with him? The questions hit like physical blows because they echoed her own deepest fears. Why had Ron never tried to seduce her? Why had he never pushed for more intimacy, never declared his feelings, never tried to make their marriage real in every sense of the word? What do you want, James? She asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. I want my family back, he said simply. I'm clean now, Peggy. Sober for 8 months. I have a job, an apartment. I can provide for you and the girls. Provide what? A one-bedroom apartment and a minimum wage job. Peggy's voice was sharp with disbelief. After 4 years of private schools and ballet lessons and everything they could ever want, you think they'll be happy in poverty? They'll be happy with their real father, James said, his voice turning hard. Their biological father who loves them more than any amount of money. You love them? Peggy stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. You sold them, James. You handed over your 4-year-old daughters to a stranger in exchange for debt forgiveness. That's not love. That's the ultimate betrayal. James stood as well, his facade of reasonableness finally cracking completely. I gave them a better life than I could provide. I made the hard choice, the sacrifice that any good father would make. You made the coward's choice, Peggy shot back, and now you want to destroy their happiness because you can't stand that they're better off without you. They're better off with their real father, James said, his voice turning dangerous. And if you won't come willingly, I'll make sure Ron Wombolt learns exactly what kind of woman he's been harboring in his precious mansion. The threat hung in the air between them like poison. What does that mean? Peggy asked, though she was afraid she already knew. It means I'll tell him the truth about how eager you were to make the deal, James said with malicious satisfaction. How you agreed to the arrangement without hesitation when you realized what kind of life it could provide. How you played the victim but were really just a gold digger who saw an opportunity and took it. That's not true, Peggy breathed. Isn't it? You signed the papers, Peggy. You came to his house. You played the perfect wife for 4 years, giving him exactly what he paid for. What do you think he'll believe when I tell him how calculated it all was? How you manipulated his desire for a family to secure your own future? Peggy felt the world tilting around her, because there was just enough truth in James's twisted version of events to make it believable. She had signed papers. She had come to Ron's house. She had played the role of wife and mother, even if her reasons were far more complex than simple greed. He won't believe you, she said, but her voice shook with uncertainty. Won't he? A man who's been rejected and abandoned by every woman he's ever tried to love? A man so desperate for a family that he'd accept a business arrangement just to have someone to come home to? James's smile was cruel and knowing. I think he'll believe exactly what I tell him. And then where will you be, Peggy? A woman with no husband, no home, no means of support, trying to raise 2 children who've grown accustomed to luxury. The picture he painted was terrifying because it was entirely possible. Ron was a proud man, a successful man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life. If he believed she'd manipulated him, used him, played on his loneliness for her own gain. What do you want? She asked for the 3rd time, her voice defeated. I want you to come home, James said, his voice becoming almost gentle again. You and the girls. We'll be a real family again, the way we were meant to be. I'll get custody of the children. Any court will side with the biological father over a man who essentially bought them. And you'll come with me, because where else do you have to go? Peggy closed her eyes, feeling trapped between impossible choices. Stay with Ron and live with the constant fear that James would destroy their happiness with his lies. Or leave with James and condemn her daughters to a life of poverty and instability, with a father they didn't remember and had no reason to trust. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until tomorrow night, James said, reaching into his wallet to leave money for his coffee. I'll be at the Marriott downtown, room 1247. Come alone and bring the girls. If you don't show up, he shrugged. Well, I suppose Ron Wombolt will be getting a very interesting phone call. As he walked away, leaving her sitting alone in the elegant hotel lobby, Peggy felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. 4 years of happiness, of security, of watching her daughters thrive in the love and protection of a man who'd become more father to them than their biological parent had ever been. All of it balanced on the edge of a knife, ready to fall into darkness. And the cruelest part was that James had planted seeds of doubt that were already taking root. Did Ron really care for her, or was she just a convenient solution to his desire for a family? Was the careful distance he maintained a sign of respect, or evidence that he saw her as property rather than a woman worthy of love? Tonight she was supposed to meet with Ron in his study, supposed to face whatever truths he'd discovered. But now she wondered if she had the courage to hear what he really thought of her, what he really believed about the woman who'd been sold to him like chattel and had been living in his house ever since. Tomorrow night, she thought, as she sat in the fading afternoon light, watching Miami's elite go about their privileged lives. Tomorrow night, everything will change one way or another. The only question was whether she'd have the strength to choose love over fear, or if 4 years of secrets and shame had already made that choice impossible. Chapter 6. Secrets in Moonlight. The most beautiful confessions are born from desperation, when the heart can no longer bear the weight of unspoken truths and chooses vulnerability over safety, love over fear. The Wombolt mansion felt different that evening, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of the conversation that would either heal or destroy everything. Peggy stood before her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling as she tried to find the courage to face Ron's study and whatever revelations waited there. She'd barely touched dinner, picking at the gourmet meal while the twins chattered about their day at school, their innocent voices a sharp contrast to the turmoil in her heart. Ron had been quieter than usual, his blue eyes holding shadows she'd never seen before, and every glance between them had felt charged with unspoken questions. Now the girls were safely tucked into their beds, their evening routine of stories and goodnight kisses completed with the kind of normalcy that might not exist tomorrow. Peggy had lingered in their room longer than usual, memorizing their faces in sleep, wondering if this would be the last night they'd all be together under this roof. A soft knock on her bedroom door made her heart jump. "Peggy," Ron's voice was gentle, careful. "Are you ready?" She opened the door to find him still in his business attire, though he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, small signs of informality that somehow made him seem more approachable and more vulnerable. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. They walked to his study in silence, the click of her heels against marble echoing in the quiet mansion. Ron held the door open for her with the same courtly manners he'd always shown, but tonight the gesture felt weighted with significance. The study was Ron's sanctuary, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, expensive artwork, and the faint scent of his cologne mingling with aged whiskey. But tonight it felt like a confessional, with moonlight streaming through tall windows and casting everything in silver shadows. "Would you like something to drink?" Ron asked, moving toward the bar. "No, thank you," Peggy said, then reconsidered. "Actually, yes, something strong." Ron poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon, his movements precise and controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself together. When he handed her the glass, their fingers brushed, and she felt that familiar electric shock that had never faded, even after 4 years. They sat across from each other, Ron behind his massive desk, Peggy in one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. The distance between them felt like an ocean, and yet the air crackled with invisible threads of connection that had been growing stronger every day they'd shared the same space. "Peggy," Ron began, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know how to start this conversation." "Start with the truth," she said quietly. Whatever you've learned, whatever you know, just say it." Ron was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the moonlight. She was so beautiful it hurt to look at her. The elegant curve of her neck, the way her dark eyes reflected the silver light, the careful way she held herself as if preparing for a blow. "I know about the contract," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Peggy's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "What contract?" "The one James signed with Dashiell Rivers 4 years ago, the one that transferred custody of the twins and arranged for you to come to me." He paused, his voice growing rougher. "I know that you were sold, Peggy. I know that none of this was your choice." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Peggy set down her bourbon with shaking hands, the glass clicking against the side table. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since yesterday. After James's visit, I had my security team investigate. The documentation was thorough." Peggy closed her eyes, feeling shame wash over her in waves. "So now you know what I really am." "What you really are?" Ron's voice was sharp with something that might have been anger. "You're a woman who was victimized by a system that failed to protect you. You're a mother who sacrificed everything to keep her children safe. I'm a woman who was sold like property," Peggy interrupted, her voice breaking. "A woman who's been living in your house under false pretenses for 4 years, playing a role I was never meant to play." Ron stood abruptly, moving around the desk to kneel beside her chair. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender that it stole her breath. "Look at me," he said softly, taking her hands in his. "Please, Peggy, look at me." She opened her eyes to find his face inches from hers, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that made her heart race. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Learning about that contract didn't change how I feel about you. It didn't make me see you differently. If anything, it made me realize how much strength it must have taken to build the life you've built here, to love those girls the way you do, to be the woman you are despite everything you've been through." "Ron, I'm not finished," he said, his thumbs brushing across her knuckles. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago, something I've been too much of a coward to admit." Peggy's heart stopped. "What?" Ron took a shaky breath, as if he were about to jump off a cliff and wasn't sure if he could fly. "I love you," he said simply. "I've been in love with you for 10 years, since that night we met at the art gallery. I've loved you through your marriage to James, through the divorce, through every day of these past 4 years when I watched you bloom in this house and wondered if you could ever feel even a fraction of what I feel for you." The words hit Peggy like a physical blow. "That's not possible." "It's not only possible, it's the truest thing I've ever said," Ron replied, his voice growing stronger. "When James brought you and the girls to me, I thought it was a miracle. The woman I'd dreamed about for 6 years was suddenly in my life, and I had a chance to show her how much she meant to me. I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, respectful enough, maybe someday you'd see me as more than just a provider." Tears were streaming down Peggy's face now. "You don't understand. I was sold to you. I came here because I had no choice, not because I wanted to be your wife. And I took you in because I was desperate to have you in my life in any way possible," Ron said, his own eyes glistening. "Not because I saw you as property, but because I saw you as the other half of my soul." "Ron, stop." "No," he said firmly, standing and pulling her to her feet with him. "I won't stop. Not when I can finally tell you the truth. Do you want to know why I never pushed for intimacy? Why I gave you your own space, your own life, your own choices within these walls?" Peggy nodded, unable to speak. "Because I wanted you to come to me freely. Because I wanted you to choose me. Not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Because love without choice isn't love at all. It's possession. And I never wanted to possess you, Peggy. I wanted to earn you." The confession broke something inside her, some wall she'd built to protect herself, from hope, from the possibility that this beautiful man could actually care for her beyond the transaction that had brought them together. "I chose you long ago," she whispered, the words torn from the depths of her heart. "I chose you that first night at the gallery, before I even knew who you were. I chose you every day for 4 years, even when I thought you could never love me back. I chose you even when I hated myself for being here, even when I felt like I was living a lie." Ron's hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Then why did you always seem so far away? Why did you pull back every time we got close?" "Because I was ashamed," she said, her voice breaking completely. "Because I knew what I was, goods that had been paid for. Because every kindness you showed me felt like charity, every moment of happiness felt stolen. How could I believe that a man like you could love a woman like me?" "A woman like you?" Ron's voice was fierce with conviction. "You mean a woman who's beautiful, intelligent, loving, strong enough to survive what would have destroyed most people? A woman who raised 2 incredible daughters and somehow managed to create a home full of love and laughter, even when her own heart was breaking?" Before Peggy could respond, before she could find more reasons to doubt what he was offering, Ron leaned down and kissed her. It was their first real kiss. Not the polite peck on the cheek at their wedding ceremony, not the careful distance they'd maintained for 4 years, but a kiss born of desperate love and years of longing. His lips were warm and soft and sure, and she felt herself melting into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, as if she could anchor herself to this moment, this feeling, this truth. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Ron rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered again. "Not because you were brought to me, but because you stayed. Not because I paid for you, but because you chose to build a life with me. I love your strength, your grace, the way you read bedtime stories, the way you make the twins laugh, the way you've made this house a home." "I love you too," Peggy said, the words feeling like freedom. "I've loved you for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like not to love you. I love your patience, your kindness, the way you never made me feel like anything but a treasured guest in your home. I love how you are with Floresa and Wilma, how you've been the father they needed without ever once making them feel like burdens. They might have stood there forever, holding each other in the moonlight, finally free to love without secrets or shame. But the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the spell, followed by an urgent knock on the study door. "Mr. Wombolt?" It was Mrs. Carmen, and her voice was tight with anxiety. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a man at the front door. He says he has legal documents regarding the children, and he's demanding to speak with Mrs. Wombolt immediately." Peggy and Ron looked at each other, their beautiful confessions suddenly pierced by harsh reality. "James," Peggy whispered, terror replacing joy in her eyes. "Let him come," Ron said, his voice hardening with determination. "It's time to finish this." But even as he spoke, even as he pulled Peggy closer to his side, both of them knew that James's arrival would test everything they'd just declared. Love was a beautiful thing, but it would take more than love to protect their family from the storm that was about to break over their heads. The battle for their future was about to begin, and this time there would be no retreat, no careful distance, no polite pretense. This time, they would fight together. Chapter 7. When Angels Refuse to Fly. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come disguised as rescue, and the hardest choice is between the love that sets you free and the fear that chains you to the past. James Ruffer stood in the Wombolt mansion's opulent foyer like a disease that had invaded paradise, his expensive suit and practiced smile unable to disguise the predatory calculation in his eyes. In his hand he held a leather portfolio that seemed to pulse with malevolent promise, and his presence filled the elegant space with tension thick enough to choke on. Ron and Peggy descended the main staircase together, and James's sharp gaze immediately noted the subtle change in their body language. The way Ron's hand rested protectively on the small of Peggy's back, the way she stood straighter in his presence, the invisible connection that seemed to bind them. "Well, well," James said, his voice carrying false joviality that made Peggy's skin crawl. "Don't you two look cozy? Finally decided to make it a real marriage, have we?" "State your business, Ruffer," Ron said, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. "It's late, and my family was enjoying a quiet evening." "Your family," James repeated, savoring the words like fine wine. "How interesting that you still think of them that way." He opened the portfolio with theatrical precision. "Because I have some documents here that might change your perspective." Peggy felt her knees go weak, but Ron's presence beside her was like an anchor in a storm. Whatever James had planned, they would face it together. "I'm listening," Ron said, though his posture suggested he was preparing for battle rather than conversation. James pulled out a sheaf of legal documents, holding them up for both to see. "Custody modification papers, filed this morning with the family court of Miami-Dade County. I'm petitioning for immediate custody of my daughters, citing abandonment by their biological father and the need to restore proper family structure." "You abandoned them," Peggy said, finding her voice despite the terror clawing at her throat. "You sold them like chattel and disappeared for 4 years." "I provided for them," James corrected smoothly. "I made arrangements for their care when I was unable to do so myself. The court will see it as a father making the ultimate sacrifice for his children's well-being. But now I'm stable, employed, and ready to be the father they deserve." Ron stepped forward, his presence suddenly radiating the kind of quiet menace that made boardrooms fall silent. "Those girls don't know you. To them, I'm their father. I'm the one who's raised them, loved them, been there for every milestone, every tear, every triumph. What court is going to rip children away from the only family they've ever known?" "A court that understands blood is thicker than money," James replied, his smile becoming sharper. "Especially when they learn about the unusual circumstances that brought these children into your care." He pulled out another document, a copy of the original contract between himself and Dashiell Rivers. Peggy's face went white at the sight of it. "You see," James continued conversationally, "when this becomes public record, as it will during custody proceedings, the media is going to have a field day. Billionaire buys family to satisfy baby fever. Human trafficking ring exposed in high society. Children sold like property in Miami's elite circles." "You bastard," Ron breathed, understanding immediately what James was threatening. "The publicity alone will destroy both of your reputations," James said with obvious satisfaction. "Your business empire will crumble under the scandal, Wombolt. And Peggy ... He turned to her with mock sympathy. "Well, the world will know exactly what you are, a woman who was literally bought and paid for." Peggy swayed on her feet, the full magnitude of James's strategy becoming clear. He wasn't just threatening to take the children, he was threatening to destroy everything they'd built, to expose their love story as something sordid and commercial. "What do you want?" Ron asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "Simple," James said, snapping the portfolio closed. "Peggy and the girls come with me tonight, quietly, without drama, without legal complications. In exchange, these documents disappear forever, and your reputation remains intact. And if we refuse, then tomorrow morning every media outlet in Miami gets copies of these contracts, along with a very compelling story about how a desperate father was forced to make impossible choices while a billionaire took advantage of his family's misfortune." James's eyes glittered with malice. "Your choice." The silence that followed was deafening. Peggy felt like she was drowning, caught between the love she'd finally been brave enough to claim and the fear of destroying the man who'd given her everything. "I need to talk to Ron alone," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," James said magnanimously, "but don't take too long. I have a car waiting outside, and we have a flight to catch in 3 hours." "A flight?" Ron's voice was sharp. "Where exactly do you think you're taking them?" "Somewhere far from Miami's gossip mill," James replied. "Somewhere my daughters can grow up knowing their real father without the complications of billionaire benefactors and purchased mothers." Ron looked like he wanted to kill James with his bare hands, but before he could respond, Peggy took his arm. "5 minutes," she said to James, then led Ron toward his study. Once the door closed behind them, Peggy collapsed into a chair, her strength finally failing her. "He's going to destroy everything," she whispered. "Your reputation, your business, everything you've worked for, all because of me." Ron knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Peggy, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing the determination there, the absolute certainty that made her heart ache. "I don't care about my reputation," he said firmly. "I don't care about the business or the media or what anyone thinks. The only thing that matters to me is you and those girls upstairs. We'll fight this together. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Peggy said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you see? He's right. The publicity alone will destroy us. And the girls, they'll be exposed to all of this ugliness, all these lies about how they came to be here." "So we tell the truth," Ron said desperately. "We tell everyone that whatever brought us together, we found real love, that those girls are loved and safe and happy, that family isn't about biology or contracts, it's about choice and commitment and showing up every day." Peggy touched his face with shaking fingers, memorizing the feel of his skin, the way his eyes held such fierce love for her. "And when they ask why you never tried to adopt them legally, when they ask why we lived separate lives for 4 years, when they dig into every aspect of our arrangement and twist it into something ugly," she shook her head. "James is right about one thing. The truth won't matter once the media gets hold of this story." "Then what are you saying?" Peggy stood, moving to the window that looked out over the garden where she'd watched Ron play with the twins countless times. "I'm saying I have to go with him." "No." Ron's voice was absolute. "Absolutely not." "I won't let him destroy you," Peggy said without turning around. "You've given us 4 years of safety, of love, of everything good in this world. I won't repay that by letting you lose everything because of us." "You're not going anywhere," Ron said, standing and moving to her. "We'll find lawyers. We'll fight this in court. We'll lose," Peggy interrupted. "And even if we won, the damage would be done. Your empire would be in ruins. Your name would be mud. And the girls would grow up knowing they were the reason for it all." She turned to face him, her decision made and written in the devastation in her eyes. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you more than I ever thought possible to love another human being. That's why I have to let you go." "Peggy, no." "Yes," she said firmly, though her voice broke on the word. "I'm going upstairs to pack a few things for the girls and myself. I'm going to wake them up and tell them we're going on a trip. And then I'm going to walk out that door with James and disappear from your life forever." "I won't let you," Ron said desperately, reaching for her. But Peggy stepped back, knowing that if he touched her, she'd lose her resolve entirely. "You have to," she whispered, "because if you really love me, if you really love those girls, you'll let us go before we destroy everything you've built." She moved toward the door, but Ron's voice stopped her. "What about the girls?" "They love me, Peggy. I'm the only father they remember. How are you going to explain to them why they can never see me again?" The question hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment her resolve wavered. How could she explain to Floresa and Wilma that they were leaving the man who'd read them bedtime stories, taught them to ride bikes, celebrated every birthday and milestone? How could she break their hearts to save his reputation? "I'll tell them," she began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You'll tell them what? That Daddy Ron didn't want them anymore? That they have to go live with a stranger who claims to be their father, but abandoned them when they needed him most?" "I'll figure something out," Peggy said weakly. "No," Ron said, his voice growing stronger. "You won't have to, because we're not running, we're not hiding, and we're not letting that bastard destroy our family." "Ron, do you trust me?" he asked, moving closer to her. "Of course, but then trust me now. Trust me to fight for us, to protect you and the girls, to find a way through this that doesn't involve losing everything we've built together." Peggy wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in his strength and determination. But the fear was too strong, the threat too real. "I can't let you lose everything for us," she said. "And I can't let you sacrifice yourself to save me," Ron replied. "That's not love, Peggy. That's martyrdom. And I won't be a party to it." Before she could respond, a knock on the study door interrupted them. "Time's up," James called from the hallway. "Have you made your decision?" Peggy looked at Ron one last time, seeing the desperate love in his eyes, the absolute refusal to let her go. She knew that if she stayed, they'd fight this together, whatever the cost, and she knew that the cost might be everything. But she also knew that some fights were worth having, even if you lost. And maybe, just maybe, love was stronger than fear after all. "We're coming," she called to James, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. When they opened the study door, James was waiting with that satisfied smile of a man who believes he's won. "Excellent choice," he said. "I knew you'd see reason." "Oh, we see something all right," Ron said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made James's smile falter. "We see a pathetic man who's so threatened by his daughter's happiness that he'd rather destroy it than admit he doesn't deserve them." "Excuse me?" James's voice turned dangerous. "You heard me," Ron continued, moving to stand beside Peggy in a show of united front. "You want to fight? You want to air all our dirty laundry in public? Bring it on. Because I've got news for you, Ruffer. I've been building my reputation for 15 years, and it's strong enough to survive whatever lies you want to tell." "Ron, what are you doing?" Peggy whispered, terrified. "I'm calling his bluff," Ron replied, never taking his eyes off James. "Because that's all this is, a bluff. He doesn't want custody of those girls. He wants money, and he figures threatening our family is the easiest way to get it." James's face flushed red with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? Then prove it. File your custody petition. Expose those contracts. Let's see how it plays out in court when the judge learns that you sold your children to pay gambling debts and then disappeared for 4 years. Ron's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because I'm betting that any publicity this generates will paint you as exactly what you are, a deadbeat father trying to cash in on his daughter's happiness." The standoff stretched between them, tension crackling in the air, and slowly, gradually, James's confident expression began to crumble as he realized his bluff had been called. The battle for their family was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Peggy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe love really was stronger than fear after all. Chapter 8. The Truth Shall Make You Free. When darkness has reigned too long, even the smallest flame becomes a beacon of hope, and sometimes the very people you think are enemies become the allies who help you find your way home. The war room at Leander Stone's law firm buzzed with purposeful energy at 6 in the morning as Miami's most powerful legal minds gathered around a polished conference table laden with documents, laptops, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. Ron sat at the head of the table, looking every inch the corporate titan he was, but Peggy could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. They'd been there since midnight, after James had stormed out of the mansion with threats of legal action and media exposure. But instead of cowering, Ron had made a series of phone calls that had assembled the finest legal team money could buy, along with private investigators, media specialists, and a woman whose presence had shocked Peggy more than anything else that had happened in the past week. "Mrs. Wombolt," said Zuleika Chen, the high-end therapist whose calm presence seemed to fill the room with serenity, "I need you to understand that nothing you tell us leaves this room. Everything is privileged, protected, and safe, but we need the complete truth if we're going to help you." Peggy looked around the table at the faces watching her, Leander with his sharp intelligence, Soraya with her fierce loyalty, Amadeo with his protective instincts, and Ron with love shining in his tired eyes. "Where do I even begin?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Begin with James," Zuleika said gently. "Tell us about your marriage, about what led to the situation 4 years ago." Peggy took a shaky breath and began to speak, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. She told them about meeting James when she was young and naive, about his charm and promises, about the gradual descent into gambling addiction and emotional abuse. She told them about the mounting debts, the threats from loan sharks, the night James came home and told her he'd found a solution. "He made it sound like salvation," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "He said Ron was infertile, desperate for a family, and that this arrangement would give the girls a better life than we could ever provide. He said it was temporary, just until he got back on his feet." "But you signed the papers," Leander said gently without judgment. "I signed papers," Peggy confirmed. "But I thought they were custody arrangements, temporary guardianship, while James got help for his addiction. I didn't realize until we arrived at the mansion that James had essentially sold us." Soraya leaned forward, her expression intense. "What exactly did you understand about the arrangement when you arrived at Ron's house?" Peggy looked at Ron, seeing the pain in his eyes as she prepared to reveal the depths of her shame. "I thought I was being hired as a nanny," she said quietly. "A live-in caregiver who would help Ron with his desire for a family while receiving housing and support for my daughters. When he mentioned marriage, I assumed it was for appearances, for legal protection. I never thought—" "You never thought what?" Zuleika prompted gently. "I never thought he could actually want me," Peggy whispered. "Not really. Not as a wife, not as a woman. I thought I was just convenient." Ron made a sound like he'd been punched, but Peggy forced herself to continue. "The first night when Ron showed me to my own bedroom, my own space, when he was so respectful and careful not to touch me or pressure me, I thought it confirmed what I believed, that I was there to provide a service, not to be loved." "And James never told you the truth about the financial arrangement?" Leander asked. "Not until yesterday," Peggy said, her voice hardening. "Not until he came back and threatened to expose everything. That's when he told me the real terms of the contract, the money that changed hands, the way I'd been purchased like property." Around the table, faces grew dark with anger on her behalf. "The son of a bitch," Amadeo muttered in Spanish, then caught himself. "Forgive me, Senora." "Don't apologize," Peggy said with a weak smile. "I've called him worse." "Okay," Leander said, making notes on his legal pad. "Now we need to discuss the current threats. James is claiming he wants custody of the girls, but we all know this is really about money. The question is, how do we prove it?" I may be able to help with that, came a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Aviora Martinez entering the conference room, followed by a woman Peggy didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of authoritative presence that suggested law enforcement. Aviora? Peggy stood, confused. What are you doing here? Being a friend, Aviora said firmly. When you didn't answer your phone last night, I got worried. I called Soraya, and she filled me in. She gestured to the woman beside her. This is Detective Elena Rodriguez with Miami PD's Financial Crimes Unit. She has some information that might help. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward, her expression serious. Mrs. Wombold, I've been investigating Dashiell Rivers and his trafficking operation for the past 2 years. James Ruffer's name came up 6 months ago when he started making inquiries about reclaiming his family. Apparently, Rivers had been holding the threat of exposure over him to keep him quiet. When Miss Martinez contacted me this morning and explained the situation, I realized you might be a key witness in our case against Rivers. The room went dead silent. Human trafficking. Ron's voice was sharp. What Mr. Ruffer did 4 years ago, selling his wife and children to settle debts. That's textbook human trafficking under Florida state law, Detective Rodriguez explained. We've been building a case against Rivers and his operation, but we needed victims willing to testify. Most are too scared or ashamed to come forward. Peggy felt the world tilt around her. Are you saying James committed a crime? I'm saying James Ruffer and Dashiell Rivers conspired to commit multiple felonies, Detective Rodriguez replied. Human trafficking, child endangerment, racketeering. If you're willing to testify, we can have both of them in custody by noon. But the contract, Peggy began, is evidence of criminal activity, not a legal document, Leander interrupted, his voice growing excited. Detective, if James and Rivers are arrested, what happens to their threats of custody proceedings and media exposure? Hard to file custody papers from jail, Detective Rodriguez said with a slight smile. And most media outlets are reluctant to run stories that implicate them in publicizing the proceeds of human trafficking. The room erupted in excited conversation, but Peggy found herself looking at Ron, seeing hope bloom in his eyes for the first time since this nightmare began. There's one more thing, Detective Rodriguez continued, raising her voice to quiet the room. Our investigation revealed that Dashiell Rivers has been blackmailing several other wealthy individuals who unknowingly became involved in similar schemes. Mr. Wombold, you're not the only one who thought they were entering into a legitimate arrangement, only to discover later that it involved trafficking victims. Other families? Soraya asked. 3 others that we know of, all involving desperate parents who sold children to wealthy individuals seeking families. Rivers has been running this operation for years, preying on both the desperate and the hopeful. Peggy felt sick to her stomach. So there are other women like me? Other children. There were, Detective Rodriguez said gently. But thanks to the evidence you can provide, we'll be able to rescue them and shut down the entire operation. What do you need from us? Ron asked, his CEO voice emerging. Mrs. Wombold's testimony about how she came to be here, copies of any documents or communications you have, and your cooperation in a controlled operation to gather additional evidence from both Ruffer and Rivers. What kind of controlled operation? Peggy asked nervously. Detective Rodriguez exchanged glances with Leander, who nodded encouragingly. We want you to call Mr. Ruffer and arrange a meeting, she explained. Tell him you've reconsidered, that you're willing to discuss his demands. We'll be recording everything, and we'll have backup in place to ensure your safety. Absolutely not, Ron said immediately. I won't have Peggy put in danger. With respect, Mr. Wombold, Mrs. Wombold is already in danger, Detective Rodriguez replied. As long as Ruffer and Rivers are free, they'll continue to threaten your family. This is the best way to end it permanently. Peggy looked around the table at the faces watching her. These people who had become her family, her support system, her reason for fighting. 4 years ago, she'd been sold like property, too ashamed and frightened to ask for help. But now she had allies, people who believed in her, people willing to fight for her freedom. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "Peggy, no." Ron reached for her hand. "Yes," she said firmly, squeezing his fingers. "I have to. Not just for us, but for those other families, those other children. I won't let fear control my life anymore." "Then we do this together," Ron said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Every step of the way." "Actually," Detective Rodriguez said with a small smile, "we have a role for you too, Mr. Wombolt. We need someone Rivers trusts, someone who can verify the financial arrangements and confirm the blackmail attempts. You're going to help us nail both of these bastards." 3 hours later, Peggy sat in her car in the parking lot of the same hotel where she'd met James the day before, wearing a wire and surrounded by unmarked police cars. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady as she made the call that would change everything. "James, it's Peggy. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, and I think you're right. Ron doesn't really love me. It's time for the girls and me to come home." On the other end of the line, she could hear the satisfaction in James's voice as he took the bait. "I knew you'd see reason. Where do you want to meet?" "The hotel bar where we talked yesterday. 1 hour. Come alone and bring those custody papers you mentioned. I want to make sure everything is legal." As she hung up the phone, Peggy felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For 4 years, she'd lived with shame and secrets, believing herself to be property rather than a person deserving of love. But now she was taking back her power, choosing to fight rather than flee, standing up not just for herself, but for other victims who'd suffered in silence. The truth was about to set them all free, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Peggy believed they were going to win. Chapter 9. Love's Fierce Reckoning. Sometimes justice arrives not with fanfare and trumpets, but with quiet determination and the fierce love of those who refuse to let evil triumph over innocence. The hotel bar was dimly lit and nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, the kind of place where secrets were traded and deals were made in shadowed corners. Peggy sat at a corner table, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for James to arrive, the small recording device Detective Rodriguez had given her, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her purse. Through the tinted windows, she could see unmarked police cars positioned strategically around the hotel, and she knew Ron was somewhere nearby, probably pacing like a caged lion and fighting every instinct that told him to burst in and protect her. But this had to be done right, legally, with evidence that would hold up in court and put both James and Dashiell Rivers away for a very long time. "Peggy." She turned to see James approaching, his expensive suit and confident smile intact. But something predatory gleamed in his eyes that made her stomach clench with familiar fear. Behind him, lurking near the bar like a well-dressed shark, was a man she didn't recognize but instinctively knew must be Dashiell Rivers. Rivers had insisted on coming. He didn't trust James to handle this alone, and his arrogance made him believe he was untouchable. "James," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the terror racing through her veins. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course, darling," James said, sliding into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who believed he'd already won. "I knew you'd come to your senses. You were always the smart one in our relationship." The casual cruelty of the statement, rewriting their history of abuse as if it had been partnership, made Peggy's jaw clench, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, hating every word she was about to speak. "About Ron only wanting me because I came with children. About him seeing me as property he'd paid for." James's smile widened. "And And I think you were right. These past 4 years, I've been living in a fantasy, pretending that what we had was real. But Ron has never truly treated me like a wife, never made me feel like anything more than a convenient arrangement. The lies tasted like poison on her tongue, especially knowing that Ron was probably listening to every word through the surveillance equipment. But she had to make this convincing, had to get James to reveal his true motives. "So you're ready to come home?" James asked, leaning forward with barely contained excitement. "I'm ready to do what's best for my daughters," Peggy said carefully. "But I need to understand what kind of life you're offering us. You said you have a job, an apartment." "I do," James said, though something flickered in his eyes. "It's not the Wombolt mansion, of course, but it's a start. We'll be a real family again, the way we were meant to be." "And what about money?" Peggy asked, knowing she was walking into dangerous territory. Raising 2 children is expensive, especially after they've grown accustomed to private schools and ballet lessons and everything Ron has provided. James's mask slipped slightly. "Well, naturally there would be some adjustments, a simpler lifestyle, more meaningful, without all the superficial luxury. Meaning we'd be poor," Peggy said bluntly. "Meaning we'd be authentic," James shot back, his voice growing sharp. "Instead of living off blood money from a man who bought you like a whore." The words hit like physical blows, but Peggy forced herself not to react. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, studying James with new eyes. "Is that really what you think of me?" she asked quietly. "After 4 years of knowing where I was, knowing I was safe and happy, you still see me as a whore." "I see you as my wife," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The mother of my children who was stolen from me by circumstances beyond my control." Stolen? Or sold? The question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. James's face went very still, and from the corner of her eye, Peggy saw Dashiell Rivers straighten at the bar, suddenly alert. "What are you getting at, Peggy?" James asked, his voice turning dangerous. "I'm getting at the truth," Peggy said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm getting at the fact that you didn't lose me to circumstances. You sold me to pay your gambling debts. You traded your wife and daughters for $2 million and the promise that Dashiell Rivers wouldn't break your legs." James went pale, his eyes darting toward Rivers, who was now moving closer to their table. "You don't know what you're talking about," James said, but his voice shook. "Don't I?" Peggy pulled out her phone, making a show of checking the time. "It's interesting, James. 4 years ago, when you told me about this arrangement, you made it sound like Ron had sought us out, like he'd chosen us specifically. But that's not what happened, is it?" "Peggy, stop." "You went to Rivers because you owed him money," Peggy continued relentlessly. "Money you'd lost gambling, money you'd stolen from your own family's future. And when he threatened to kill you, you offered him the only things of value you had left. Your wife and children. That's not... It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," Peggy said, standing up from the table. "You sold us, James. You literally sold human beings to save your own worthless life. And now you want to do it again." James shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage and panic. "You ungrateful bitch. Do you have any idea what I sacrificed for you? What I gave up?" "Your humanity," Peggy said simply. "That's what you gave up." It was then that Dashiell Rivers stepped out of the shadows, revealing himself fully for the first time. He was a small, neat man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his lips. "Mrs. Wombolt," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that made every word sound like a threat. "I think you've said quite enough." "Mr. Rivers, I presume," Peggy said, surprised by her own calm. "I've been looking forward to meeting the man who's built a career out of buying and selling human beings." Rivers' smile became sharper. "I provide solutions to difficult problems. Your husband had debts. Your current patron had needs. I simply facilitated a mutually beneficial arrangement. You trafficked children, Peggy said bluntly. You're a criminal who preys on desperate families. I'm a businessman, Rivers corrected. And right now, I'm a businessman who's growing tired of this conversation. James, I think it's time we reminded Mrs. Wombolt of the realities of her situation. But before either man could move, the hotel bar suddenly filled with people. Detective Rodriguez and her team moving with the swift precision of a military operation. Within seconds, James and Rivers found themselves surrounded, hands reaching for weapons that were already being taken away. James Ruffer, Dashiell Rivers, you're under arrest for human trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy, Detective Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights were read and handcuffs clicked into place, Peggy felt her knees go weak with relief. It was over. Finally, after 4 years of shame and secrets, it was over. Peggy! She turned to see Ron burst through the hotel bar's entrance, his face white with concern and relief. He reached her in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with the desperation that spoke of hours spent terrified for her safety. It's done, she whispered against his chest. It's finally done. You were incredible, he said, his voice rough with emotion. So brave, so strong. I was terrified the whole time, but you were incredible. As James and Rivers were led away in handcuffs, James turned back one last time, his face twisted with rage and defeat. This isn't over, he shouted. Those are my daughters, my blood. No court will keep them from their real father. Actually, came a new voice from behind them, that's exactly what's going to happen. Everyone turned to see Leander Stone approaching with a folder of documents and the satisfied expression of a lawyer who just won the case of a lifetime. Congratulations, Ron, Peggy, he said, his smile wide and genuine. I have here emergency custody orders signed by Judge Martinez, granting you immediate and permanent guardianship of Floresa and Wilma. Given the circumstances of their father's arrest for trafficking them, the court has determined that their best interests lie with the family who has provided them with love, stability, and protection for the past 4 years. Peggy felt tears streaming down her face as the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. They were free. The girls were safe. The nightmare was over. There's more, Leander continued, his voice growing even more pleased. The FBI has agreed to freeze all media coverage of this case, pending their broader investigation into Rivers' trafficking operation. Your names will be kept out of the press, and when this does eventually become public, it will be framed as the rescue of trafficking victims, not as any kind of scandal. What about the other families Detective Rodriguez mentioned? Peggy asked. 3 other trafficking rings have been shut down based on the evidence we gathered today, Detective Rodriguez said, approaching with her own satisfied smile. 12 children have been returned to safety, and we've arrested 7 individuals involved in the operation. Mrs. Wombolt, your courage today saved more lives than just your own. As the hotel bar emptied of police and criminals, Peggy found herself alone with Ron in the aftermath of their victory. But instead of celebration, she felt a strange emptiness, as if she'd been holding her breath for so long that she'd forgotten how to breathe normally. What happens now? She asked, suddenly uncertain. Ron cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Now we go home, he said simply. We go home to our daughters, and we start the rest of our lives as a real family. No contracts, no arrangements, no shadows from the past. Just us, choosing each other every day because we want to, not because we have to. Just like that. Just like that, Ron confirmed, then leaned down to kiss her with all the passion and promise that 4 years of careful distance had held back. I love you, Peggy Bootin Wombolt, not because you were brought to me, but because you chose to stay. Not because of any arrangement or contract, but because you're the other half of my soul. I love you too, Peggy whispered against his lips, and I choose you, Ron Wombolt, today, tomorrow, and for all the days of our lives. As they walked out of the hotel together, hand in hand for the first time in 4 years, Peggy felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. True freedom. The freedom to love without shame, to build a future without fear, to be a family not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. The battle was won, but their story was just beginning. Chapter 10. Where Love Writes Its Forever. True love stories don't end with happily ever after. They begin with it, each day a new page written in the language of chosen devotion, and the courage to believe that some miracles are worth waiting 10 years to receive. The Miami Art Gallery glowed with the same golden warmth it had possessed a decade ago, but tonight it felt transformed into something magical, like a cathedral built for the worship of second chances and dreams finally coming true. Peggy stood before the familiar wall where her paintings had once hung, but now the space was filled with new works, pieces she'd created during their 4 years together, each canvas unconsciously documenting her journey from despair to hope to love. "Mommy, you're shaking again," Wilma observed with the quiet perception that never failed to catch adults off guard. At 8 years old, she possessed an artist's eye for detail and an old soul's understanding of emotion. "Happy shaking this time, sweetheart," Peggy said, smoothing her daughter's perfectly styled hair. Both twins looked like angels in their matching ivory dresses, their faces glowing with the excitement of being part of something momentous, though they still didn't know exactly what Ron had planned. "Is Daddy Ron really going to ask you to marry him again?" Florissa whispered, bouncing on her toes with barely contained enthusiasm. "With a real ring this time, not just papers?" "I think so," Peggy whispered back, her heart racing with anticipation. "But it's supposed to be a surprise, so we have to pretend we don't know." "We're excellent at pretending," Wilma said solemnly. "We've been practicing all week." The gallery was filled with their closest friends and family, Soraya looking elegant in midnight blue, Leander and his wife chatting with Detective Rodriguez, Aviora holding hands with the kind detective she'd been dating since the arrests, and Elsinora Blackwell presiding over everything with the satisfaction of a woman who'd always known this day would come. "He's here," Florissa announced in a stage whisper, and Peggy's breath caught as Ron appeared at the gallery's entrance. He was devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but it was the expression on his face that stole her breath. Pure, unbridled love mixed with the nervousness of a man about to put his heart on the line in the most public way possible. In his hand he carried a small velvet box that seemed to pulse with promise. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of the gallery director, "if I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted, turning toward where Ron now stood beside Peggy's latest painting, a stunning piece titled "Dancing with Destiny," that showed a family of 4 silhouetted against a Miami sunset, their hands joined, their faces turned toward light. "10 years ago," Ron began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "I walked into this gallery as a successful but lonely man, searching for something I couldn't name. I found it in the most unexpected way, not in the art on the walls, but in the artist who created it." His eyes found Peggy's across the room, and she felt her heart stop at the tenderness she saw there. "I fell in love that night with a woman who believed in beauty, who saw hope in darkness, who had the courage to dream even when life had given her every reason to stop believing in happy endings." Ron moved closer, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. "What I didn't know was that I would have to wait 10 years to tell her how I felt." Peggy's eyes filled with tears as Ron approached, the twins flanking her like small guardian angels. Life took us on a complicated journey, Ron continued, his voice growing stronger. We came together through circumstances that were far from ideal, but we built something beautiful from those broken pieces. We created a family not through biology or contracts, but through choice, choosing each day to love, to trust, to believe that what we had was real and worth fighting for. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his blue eyes, could smell the cologne that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Peggy Boutin," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. "You are the most courageous, beautiful, extraordinary woman I have ever known. You took two frightened little girls and a damaged man and somehow created a home filled with laughter and love. You've been my partner, my strength, my reason for believing in tomorrow." Ron dropped to one knee, pulling out the velvet box with hands that trembled with emotion. The diamond inside was stunning, not ostentatiously large, but perfectly cut, surrounded by smaller stones that caught the gallery lights like captured stars. "This time," he said, his voice thick with meaning, "I'm asking not because circumstances demand it, but because my heart demands it. I'm asking you to marry me not because you have to, but because I can't imagine spending another day of my life without you as my wife, my partner, my forever." The gallery was dead silent, everyone holding their breath as they waited for Peggy's answer. "Mommy," Florisa whispered urgently, "he asked you a question." Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension, and Peggy found herself laughing through her tears. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong. "Yes, Ron Wombolt, I will marry you. I will choose you every day for the rest of my life, not because I have to, but because loving you is the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done." The gallery erupted in cheers and applause as Ron slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to kiss her with all the passion that 4 years of careful restraint had held back. It was a kiss that tasted of promises and forever, of battles won and love freely given. "Group hug," Florisa declared, and suddenly they were surrounded by small arms and the kind of joy that only children could provide. "We're really going to be a family?" Wilma asked, looking up at Ron with eyes that held the wisdom of someone far older than 8. "We've always been a family, Princess," Ron said, ruffling her hair. "Now it's just official." The same garden where Peggy had watched Ron play with the twins through her bedroom window had been transformed into a fairy tale wedding venue. White orchids cascaded from every surface, string lights created a canopy of stars, and the Miami sunset painted everything in shades of gold and pink that no artist could have improved upon. Peggy stood at the end of the petal-strewn aisle in a dress that made her look like a goddess, ivory silk that flowed like water, delicate beading that caught the light, and a smile that outshone everything else. The twins walked before her as flower girls, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of children given an important job. But it was Ron's face when he saw her that made the entire day perfect. He stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking like every woman's dream of Prince Charming, but his eyes held something deeper than fairy tale romance. They held the kind of love that had survived tests and trials, that had been earned through patience and proven through adversity. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Peggy barely heard the traditional words. She was lost in Ron's eyes, in the way he was looking at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. When it came time for their vows, Ron spoke first, his voice steady and sure. "Peggy, 10 years ago you taught me that love isn't about possession, it's about liberation. You've spent 4 years showing me that the best things in life can't be bought or sold, only given freely and received with gratitude. Today I vow to love you not because you belong to me, but because you choose to be with me. I promise to earn that choice every day of our lives." Peggy's voice was clear and strong as she replied, Ron, you showed me that I was worthy of love when I believed I was only worthy of transaction. You taught me that family isn't about blood or contracts. It's about showing up every day with open hearts and willing hands. I vow to choose you not because I have to, but because choosing you feels like choosing joy, choosing hope, choosing home. As they exchanged rings, real ones this time, chosen together, worn with joy rather than obligation, Peggy felt the last shadows of shame and fear finally lift from her heart. "You may kiss your bride," the minister announced, and Ron's kiss was everything their first kiss in his study had promised. Passionate, tender, full of the kind of love that could move mountains and heal hearts. The reception flowed around them like a dream. Their first dance was to "At Last" by Etta James, and as they swayed together under the string lights, Peggy whispered in Ron's ear, "I choose you, Ron Wombolt, not because I have to, but because I cannot imagine loving anyone else." "And I choose you," he whispered back, "not because you were delivered to me, but because you stayed. Not because of any contract, but because you're the other half of my soul." As Miami's skyline twinkled in the distance and their family and friends celebrated around them, Peggy realized that some stories that begin with endings find their way to light. Some loves that start in darkness become stronger than those that never faced the storm. Some families that are born from broken pieces discover that their cracks are where the light gets in. They had traveled through hell to find heaven, had journeyed through shame to reach joy, had discovered that the most beautiful love stories aren't the ones that start perfectly, but the ones that end with the courage to choose each other every day, forever. The transaction that had brought them together was history. The love they had built together was eternal. And as they danced under the Miami stars, surrounded by the laughter of their daughters and the joy of their friends, Peggy knew with absolute certainty that some miracles are worth waiting for, some loves are worth fighting for, and some families are destined to be, not through purchase, but through the most powerful transaction of all, love freely given and gratefully received. The end.